While exploring Boston Common, an abandoned Central Public Park in downtown Boston, you'll likely encounter Super Mutants, feral ghouls and raiders, some of which, when critically injured, will retreat, but not before telling you they don't have to kill you, they'll let Swan do it instead. Looking around, you notice something at the center of the park, a pond, the Swan Pond. Originally, this pond was far larger before it was downsized several times over to the size of a glorified puddle. A puddle that was so unimpressive that tourists would actually cry upon seeing it. And those that stuck around afterwards to ride the swan boats frequently crashed into each other because there simply wasn't enough room to move. Around the edges of the common and leaking into the streets beyond are warning signs: stay back, keep out, danger, Swan. But who or what is Swan? Heading closer to the pond, we find a boat with a swan attached. Although it doesn't appear to be a threat, there are multiple bodies and holotapes belonging to those who didn't heed these warnings. There's Mikhail, who tried to brave the dangers to reunite with his loved one, though his lover pleaded with him to stay in Diamond City where it was safe, knew he would ultimately make the trip. So they warned him to travel at night, to stick to the river, and above all else, avoid the common. There's Kath, who was dared to go into the common to kill Swan. A torn note reveals she wasn't the only one. Davies, another raider, was also dared to go into the common and kill Swan, only to have his head torn off. There's also the Fugitives holotape, where we can actually hear the Swan for the first time.
Lost them?
Yeah. We made it, Molly. We made it.
Why'd they let us go?
No, come on. Let's keep moving.
Wait, the Common. You've heard about the Common.
Oh, God. Mar, look out!
And the final note I'll mention for now before going into the pond is a note titled Raider's Advice, where an unnamed raider has put together a plan of attack, but warns the reader, whatever they do, to not go into the pond. Ignoring the sound advice and moving closer, we see something bobbing in the water, a pile of debris made up of a tire, a branch, and a white swan, the same as the one from the boat. Getting closer to the mass, Swan reveals himself. With a pained roar much like the one from the Fugitives holotape, he calls out a garbled version of his own name and attacks, slamming the ground with an anchor, charging, throwing rocks, and even blocking attacks with a makeshift shield made from the bow of a swan boat. The behemoth's face is painted white with black eyes, which may be where his nickname came from, as his resemblance ever so slightly mimics that of a swan. Or perhaps he's named after the plastic swan that's fixed to his back, and while hiding beneath the murky water, is the only thing that appears to be alive, bobbing on the surface of the pond while the true, living creature remains out of sight. In a cruel twist of fate, the name he once had as a human, before he became the giant abomination we see now, was also Swan, Edgar Swan. Once upon a time, Edgar Swan worked for the Institute as a low-level worker whose wandering fingers got him in trouble after he was caught stealing cigarettes. Surprisingly, the Institute were lenient in their punishment, telling Swan that all he had to do to make up for his wrongdoing was to live in isolation for a month. All the food and drink he could want would be provided, and the only thing he actually had to do during his sentence was to record his condition. Swan couldn't believe his luck. To have been caught stealing, only to be given an all-inclusive month-long vacation was fantastic, but unbeknownst to him, he had secretly been infected with FEV and the isolation period was just a ruse. They even had him documenting his own experience. By the 6th day, Swan realized that something was wrong when the scientists returned for additional tests. He was told he was going to be left alone, isolated for a whole month, yet here they were taking their pound of flesh. It wasn't long before his body ached, so much so even writing a simple entry was incredibly taxing. Swan was constantly on edge, jittery and agitated, and it was obvious the scientists had done something to him, although he didn't know what. 2 weeks into the experiment, Swan's condition not only stabilized, but actually improved. His muscle mass tripled and his intelligence greatly increased, which allowed him to reason that the effects he was feeling must have been from a new strain of FEV, a strain that was turning him into a superhuman, and now he was enthusiastic about the experiment, so much so he applied to join the research team and waited with anticipation in the hopes of assisting in his own experiment. However, 3 weeks into the experiment, his mental faculties declined, and then he began to experience seizures. He was swiftly returned to the observation lab, where he realized whatever strain of FEV he had been infected with was unstable, and the seizures were only just the beginning. Swan's health rapidly deteriorated, and he had no choice but to wait for the virus to either kill him or turn him into something else, which frightened him. He knew those mutated by FEV were always rejected to the wasteland, to the surface, to the Commonwealth, a dangerous and savage place. The idea of having to brace the outside world, as a mutant no less, was unbearable, but it was something all super mutants in Boston have at one point in time gone through, and Edgar Swan was no different. After Swan was exiled to the surface, he desperately hunted for a place to hide. After who knows how long, he found his way to Boston Common to the groundskeeper shack, somewhere he felt safe enough to call home. For a time, Swan continued to record his condition, but the virus forced his body to continue growing until the shack was far too small to protect him from the Commonwealth, and the only place left to hide was the pond. If disturbed, he will roar his own name, perhaps psyching himself up to face the incoming danger, but once that threat has been taken care of, he returns to his pond to continue hiding. Ultimately, Swan isn't a threat. Not really, anyway. He's just afraid. He shields himself from harm's way and has allowed people to get close enough to the Common to leave warnings, but he doesn't actively hunt them. He just wants to be left alone.
Swan. Yes, I saw his file. He was one of our first test subjects, years ago. His mutations destabilized, started turning into a behemoth. You think that could happen to me? Maybe I'm fine for a few months, a few years, but... God, I couldn't live like that.
Be sure to show your support by liking the video and subscribing if you haven't already for more Fallout content. If there's anything you would like to see in a later video, leave a comment and I'll see what I can do. With that said, thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.